There's a street in our town that everyone knows, yet no one dares to talk about, Hollow Street. It sits at the edge of town, shrouded in mist and mystery, leading nowhere but toward a row of houses that have long been left to rot. The entire block was abandoned decades ago, after a string of strange disappearances left the street completely empty. And at the very end of it, standing alone under a dead, leaning tree, is the last house on Hollow Street. Some say it's cursed, others say it's haunted, and if you're smart, you'll stay far, far away. I wish I'd listened to the stories. It was a cold October night when my friends convinced me to go with them to Hollow Street. It was supposed to be a harmless thrill, a little scare to get us all excited for Halloween. They dared me to step inside the last house, the one with the broken windows and the sagging roof. My friends promised they'd wait outside, ready to film my reaction and get a good laugh. I wanted to back out, but peer pressure can be powerful. So, heart-pounding, I agreed. As I approached the house, I felt a chill settle over me, colder than the autumn air. The house loomed above, its darkened windows like hollow eyes, staring down at me, challenging me to enter. I swallowed hard and took the first step onto the creaking porch. My friends were all laughing and goading me on, telling me not to chicken out, but their voices seemed to fade as I neared the door. The closer I got, the quieter everything became, until all I could hear was the crunch of leaves underfoot and the rapid beating of my own heart. I took a deep breath and pushed open the door. The hinges groaned, echoing down the hall as the smell of mildew and decay filled my lungs. I almost turned back right then, but something, curiosity, pride, or maybe just plain fear, urged me forward. Inside, the house was a time capsule frozen in a state of decay. Dust clung to everything, from the broken furniture to the peeling wallpaper. A strange feeling crept over me, as if I wasn't alone. The shadows seemed to dance in the corners, shifting with the flickering light from my flashlight. Every step I took echoed louder than the last, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, following me. I wandered through the rooms, hoping to find something interesting to tell my friends about, something to make it worth the dare. But everything was eerily normal, until I reached the stairs. They led up into darkness, each step worn and splintered, disappearing into the shadowy depths above. A strange noise drifted down from the upper floor, a faint scratching sound, like nails on wood. I froze, my pulse quickening. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe it was the wind. But deep down, I knew it was neither. I stood at the base of the stairs, debating whether to turn back. But as I hesitated, the scratching sound grew louder, more insistent, as if something or someone was daring me to come closer. So, against my better judgment, I took the first step. Then another, and another. The air grew colder with each step, and I could feel the walls closing in, pressing down on me as I climbed higher. When I reached the top, I found myself facing a long, narrow hallway lined with doors. Most of them were closed, except for one at the very end. The scratching had stopped, replaced by a heavy silence that weighed down on me like a blanket. I felt drawn toward that open door, an almost magnetic pull urging me forward. My heart raced, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, to leave this house and never return. But I couldn't stop myself. The room beyond the door was dark, with a single cracked window casting a thin beam of moonlight across the floor. I shone my flashlight around, illuminating broken furniture, torn curtains, and scattered papers. But what caught my eye was the figure standing by the window. It was a woman, dressed in an old, tattered dress, her long, dark hair covering her face. She was facing away from me, her shoulders slumped, as if she was tired or in pain. My breath caught in my throat, and I took a step back, my flashlight shaking in my hand. "Hello," I whispered, barely audible, my voice quivering. She didn't respond. She didn't move. She just stood there, completely still like a statue frozen in time. I couldn't take my eyes off her, even though every fiber of my being was telling me to run. Then slowly she began to turn. Her movements were slow and jerky, as if she was struggling to move, like something was holding her back. And as her face came into view, I felt a wave of terror wash over me. Her skin was pale and cracked, her eyes hollow and dark, like empty sockets staring into nothingness. Her mouth was twisted into a grimace, as if she was silently screaming, trapped in a perpetual state of agony. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my flashlight. The woman's eyes, or what was left of them, seemed to follow me, boring into me with an intensity that felt almost alive. Suddenly, she opened her mouth. A soft, raspy whisper escaped her lips, barely more than a breath, but it sent chills down my spine. "Help me!" I backed out of the room, my heart racing, my mind a blur of panic and fear. But as I turned to flee, I heard footsteps behind me, heavy and deliberate, echoing down the hallway. I turned back, shining my flashlight into the darkness, but there was nothing there. Then, the door slammed shut, trapping me in the darkness. I pounded on the door, shouting for help, but my voice seemed to vanish into the silence. I could feel a presence behind me, the air growing colder, thicker, as if something was standing right there, breathing down my neck. I turned, shining my flashlight wildly around the room, but there was nothing, just shadows, dancing along the walls, twisting and shifting like they were alive. The woman's voice echoed in my ears, softer now, almost pleading. "Help me." I don't remember how I made it out of that room. All I remember is running, stumbling down the stairs, the walls seeming to close in around me, the shadows reaching out like twisted fingers. I burst through the front door, gasping for breath, and stumbled onto the porch, where my friends were waiting, their laughter dying as they saw the look on my face. I didn't say a word. I just ran, leaving that cursed house behind, feeling the weight of unseen eyes watching me as I fled. I never went back to Hollow Street. None of us did. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and the shadows are long, I hear her voice, faint and desperate, calling out from the darkness. "Help me." And I wonder if I left a piece of myself behind in that house, trapped with her in the darkness, waiting, forever haunted by the ghost of the last house on Hollow Street. When we moved into our new neighborhood, the first thing that caught my attention was the house across the street. It was an old, sagging two-story with peeling paint, darkened windows, and an overgrown yard filled with weeds and twisted trees. No one seemed to live there, or if they did, they certainly never came out. Everyone in the neighborhood had something to say about that house, though. The neighbors said it had been abandoned for years, left to decay, and no one wanted to buy it because of the rumors. They called it the witch house. Kids dared each other to get close, tossing rocks and sprinting away when they heard the slightest noise. I thought it was all silly superstition, just the way people talk about the creepy old house in every town. But my little sister, Emma, became obsessed with it. "It's not empty," she'd say every night, looking out the window with her nose pressed to the glass. "There's a light in the attic." My parents brushed it off as imagination, and I tried to do the same. But sometimes, when I lay awake at night, I'd catch a faint, flickering glow in one of the attic windows. I told myself it was just the streetlight or a trick of the moon, but part of me couldn't shake the feeling that there was something or someone in that house. Things got stranger over the next few weeks. One evening, Emma came running down from her room, pale as a ghost. She waved at me, she whispered. Who waved? I asked, half expecting her to say she'd made a new friend. The witch. From the attic window, she replied, trembling. She was smiling at me. I went upstairs and looked out Emma's window. The house was dark and lifeless, just as it had always been. But Emma was certain. Every night after that, she would sit at her window watching, waiting. I tried to convince her to stop, but she insisted. Then one night I saw it too. It was around midnight. I was half asleep when I heard Emma whispering. I opened my eyes and saw her standing at the window, talking softly to something or someone outside. The hair on the back of my neck prickled. I got up and went to her, putting my hand on her shoulder. Emma, who are you talking to? The lady, she said without looking away. She says her name is Abigail. I felt a cold chill creep down my spine. Emma, there's no one there. But when I looked out the window, my heart stopped. In the attic window of the house across the street, I saw a figure, a woman with long, dark hair and hollow eyes, standing in the shadows. She raised a pale hand and waved, a slow, unsettling motion that sent a jolt of terror through me. I grabbed Emma and pulled her away from the window, shutting the curtains. The next day, I did some digging. I asked around the neighborhood, trying to find out if anyone knew who had lived there or if there was any truth to the witch rumors. Most people just shrugged, saying it was an old house with a dark past. But one elderly neighbor told me more. It was owned by Abigail Moore, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. She was a strange woman, always kept to herself, never came outside. People in town said she was a witch. Kids dared each other to go up to her door, and sometimes they'd swear they heard her chanting strange words inside. Then one day she just disappeared, left without a trace. No one's seen her since. I felt a creeping sense of dread settle in my stomach. Was Emma really seeing Abigail Moore? That night, I decided to keep watch myself. I sat by the window in my room, staring at the house across the street, waiting for any sign of movement. For hours, nothing happened. But just as I was about to give up, I saw it. A faint, flickering light in the attic window. And then she appeared. Abigail Moore, or whatever was left of her, stood in the window, staring directly at me. Her face was pale, almost luminous in the darkness, and her eyes seemed to pierce through the shadows. She lifted her hand, slowly, beckoning me. I couldn't look away, even as my body screamed at me to run. Then, without breaking eye contact, she mouthed something. I couldn't hear her, but I could see her lips move. Come. I backed away from the window, my heart racing. But something strange compelled me. Against my better judgment, I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, crossing the street. I felt like I was in a trance, as if her gaze had put some kind of spell over me. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears as I stepped up to the front door of the witch house. The door creaked open before I even touched it, as if it had been waiting for me. I stepped inside, the air thick with the scent of mold and dust. The house was freezing, colder than it had any right to be, and every step I took seemed to echo through the darkness. Then, I heard her voice, a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Welcome, my child. I froze, feeling her presence close by. My flashlight flickered, and in the dim beam, I saw her standing at the end of the hallway, smiling. Her face was distorted, her eyes too large, her smile too wide, as if she was stretching the skin just to look more human. Why did you call me here? I managed to stammer. She tilted her head, her smile never faltering. I need you to carry on my legacy. Someone needs to keep watch. I stumbled backward, heart hammering, but she raised her hand and I felt an invisible force hold me in place. My child, you will stay. she murmured, her voice wrapping around me like ice, just as they all have before. And in that moment, I realized every person who had ever dared to step inside this house had never left. They had all become part of it, bound to the witch house, cursed to haunt it as she did. I could feel it, the weight of their souls pressing in on me, whispering, pleading, summoning every ounce of strength. I turned and ran, barely breaking free from her grip. I burst out of the house, stumbling into the street, gasping for air. I never went back to that window. I never looked at the witch house again. But every now and then, late at night, I'll catch a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye. A figure standing at the window across the street, watching, waiting. And sometimes, when the night is quiet, I can still hear her whisper in the wind, "Come." Growing up, my parents would always send me to spend the summers at my grandpa's house in the village. The old house had a certain charm to it, surrounded by tall trees and fields that stretched out endlessly. But when the sun went down, that charm faded, and the house took on a much darker feel. Every creak of the wooden floors, every rustle outside the windows seemed to echo louder at night. And there was one room, Grandpa's old study, that we were never allowed to enter. I never understood why. It was just a room, locked up and forgotten. Grandpa would brush off my questions, but every so often, I'd catch him looking at the door with a distant expression, like it was hiding something he didn't want to remember. One summer, Grandpa fell ill, and I ended up at his house to help take care of him. By then, I was old enough to stay alone, and after a few days, Grandpa had to be taken to the city for better treatment. I was left with instructions to keep the house in order and to stay out of that room. He made sure to emphasize that part, which only deepened my curiosity. The first few days went by quietly. I spent my time wandering the woods, reading, and taking care of small chores around the house. But at night, I'd lie in bed, listening to the sounds of the old house settling, feeling a strange unease creep over me as I lay awake. The creaks seemed louder than usual, and the silence felt heavy, like it was waiting for something. Then one night I heard it, a faint sound coming from Grandpa's study. It was soft, almost like a whisper, too low to make out words. My heart pounded in my chest, and I tried to convince myself it was just the house, that it was nothing unusual. But the noise continued, growing slightly louder, until it sounded almost like breathing. Slow, steady, as if someone or something was in that room. I tried to ignore it, but as the night wore on, the sound only grew more insistent. Curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way down the hall, the old floorboards groaning under my weight. The door to Grandpa's study loomed ahead, dark and ominous. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob. To my surprise, the door was unlocked. As I stepped inside, I was hit by a wave of cold air that made my skin crawl. The room was untouched, with dusty shelves filled with old books and a large ornate desk covered in faded papers. It was clear no one had been in there for years. Yet, the air felt thick, almost suffocating, as if the room itself was alive. I walked around, my flashlight illuminating strange trinkets and odd artifacts Grandpa had collected over the years. There was a strange-looking mirror, an ancient clock that had long since stopped ticking, and shelves lined with jars of herbs and other unidentifiable things. But what drew my attention was a small wooden box sitting on the desk, engraved with strange symbols I'd never seen before. Compelled by a strange feeling, I reached out and opened the box. Inside was an old, crumbling piece of parchment covered in faded writing. As I squinted to make out the words, I realized it wasn't in any language I recognized. The symbols seemed to twist and change as I looked at them, making me feel dizzy. And then, as if from nowhere, a whisper filled the room. "Leave now." I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The voice was faint, barely more than a hiss, but it was clear, as if someone was standing right beside me. I whipped around, but the room was empty. Only shadows danced in the corners, twisting and stretching as if alive. A chill ran down my spine, and I backed away, my eyes fixed on the empty room. But just as I turned to leave, the door slammed shut, trapping me inside. Panic set in as I tugged at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The room seemed to grow colder, and the shadows grew darker, closing in on me from all sides. Then I saw it, a figure standing in the corner, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, impossibly thin, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through me. Its mouth was twisted into a sinister grin, and its hands, long and bony, reached out toward me. I pressed myself against the door, my heart racing as the figure slowly advanced, its footsteps silent on the floor. A voice filled the room, soft and mocking. "You shouldn't have come here," it whispered, each word dripping with malice. I shut my eyes, hoping it was just a nightmare, that I'd wake up in my bed, safe and sound. But the feeling of those cold eyes on me was all too real. I could feel its presence, the air growing heavier as it drew closer. Desperation took over, and I began pounding on the door, shouting for help, even though I knew there was no one around to hear me. The figure stopped just inches away from me, and I felt a cold hand brush against my cheek, sending a jolt of terror through me. I gasped, jerking back, but there was nowhere to go. Its voice echoed in my mind, filling me with a deep, primal fear. "You can't leave now. You're part of this house." With a sudden surge of adrenaline, I turned and threw my weight against the door. It burst open, and I stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air. I didn't dare look back as I ran, my footsteps echoing down the hall. I burst out of the house, slamming the front door behind me, and didn't stop running until I was far down the road. When I finally looked back, the house stood silent and dark, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. That house held secrets, things that were never meant to be disturbed. I never went back, and I refused to speak of what happened to anyone. A few weeks later, I received a letter. It was from my grandpa. He was doing better, he said, but he wouldn't be returning to the house. He told me to stay away, that some doors are meant to stay closed, some rooms untouched. But the last line of the letter sent a shiver down my spine. "If you hear it calling, do not answer. Once it knows you, it will never forget." I moved away after that, putting as much distance as possible between myself and that cursed place. But even now, sometimes in the dead of night, I hear the whispers, faint and distant, as if calling from a place just out of reach. I'll never go back to Grandpa's house, but I know, deep down, that it's waiting for me. My girlfriend, Lily, and I had been saving for months to finally move in together, and we found a rental house that seemed too good to be true. Cheap, spacious, and located in a quiet area on the edge of town. The house was old, sure, but it had charm, arched doorways, an antique fireplace, and tall windows overlooking an empty field. We signed the lease without hesitation. The first few days went smoothly as we unpacked, decorated, and even hosted a small housewarming party with friends who joked about the creepy vibes. But we laughed it off, chalking it up to the house's age. However, things began to change on the fourth night. I woke up to a strange scratching sound behind our bed, thinking it was a mouse or critter, but over the following nights, the noises grew louder, scratching, tapping, and what almost sounded like whispers. Lily heard it too, and one night she shook me awake, pale-faced, asking if I heard it. We both sat in the dark, holding our breath until the whispering stopped. The next night, we were awakened by slow, deliberate footsteps in the hallway. The steps grew closer, stopped outside our door, and then the doorknob rattled slightly before the footsteps faded into silence. We didn't sleep the rest of the night, and when we checked the empty hallway in the morning, the air felt thick, as if someone had been watching us. Lily wanted to leave immediately, but I convinced her to stay, reasoning it was just an old house settling. That night, Lily slept with the lamp on, and I stayed awake, but everything was quiet until a sudden, intense coldness washed over the room. When I opened my eyes, I saw a tall, shadowy figure at the foot of the bed, its face featureless, flickering in and out of focus, dressed in an old, tattered dress. It pointed at me, and I froze, unable to move. When I blinked, it was gone. I woke Lily, and we spent the rest of the night in the living room with the lights on. The next morning, we researched the house at the local library and discovered a dark history. The house had once belonged to a woman named Eleanor, who had lived there alone after her husband's tragic death. She had gone mad with grief and isolation, and one night, she vanished without a trace. Rumors said she either took her own life or something darker happened. Since then, every family that lived in the house reported strange occurrences, from footsteps and whispers to sightings of a shadowy figure. Many left within weeks, and some were never heard from again. Terrified, we decided to pack up and leave, but the house seemed to come alive. The lights flickered, doors slammed, and the temperature dropped sharply. When we tried to leave, the front door wouldn't open, and the whispering voices grew louder. Then we saw her, Eleanor, standing at the top of the stairs, her hollow eyes fixed on us, her mouth twisting into a horrible smile as she descended the stairs, pointing at us. In desperation, we ran to the back door, but it was locked too. I smashed a window with a chair, and we scrambled through, cutting ourselves on the glass but not caring. We ran through the overgrown yard and didn't look back until we reached the road. Looking back at the house, it was silent and dark, but in one of the upstairs windows, we saw Eleanor's shadowy figure, still watching with that twisted smile. We never went back for our things or contacted the landlord. We just left town and tried to forget. But sometimes, late at night, I wake up to the sound of soft whispers, and I swear I can see her face, watching from the shadows, waiting. I know deep down that Eleanor isn't done with us yet. It all started when the house next door went on the market. I had lived in my home for nearly 10 years, watching neighbors come and go, but this one was different. The house sat empty for months, with no interest despite dropping prices. I thought it odd but didn't dwell on it. Then one autumn evening, while raking leaves, I noticed a moving truck at the house. A couple, both dressed in black, carried boxes and furniture inside without acknowledging me. It felt strange, but I brushed it off. Later that night, I noticed a light in the upper floor window of their house, always the same window, illuminating a figure that seemed to stare back at me. The next day, I encountered the woman outside, her clothes out of place, and she spoke in a soft, eerie tone, saying, "It's safer that way." That night, I heard low, rhythmic chanting coming from their house, which lingered in my dreams. When I went outside the next morning, the house looked deserted, blinds drawn, mailbox stuffed with unopened letters. The chanting continued every night, and the figure in the window stared longer each time. One night, I woke to a knock at my door at midnight, but no one was there. I heard footsteps upstairs and found the woman from next door standing by my window, saying, "You shouldn't have looked. They see you now. They know." Then she pointed to a figure in her house, the man watching us with an intensity that chilled me. She whispered, "Leave before they come." Terrified, I fled to a motel. The next morning, the house was up for sale again, as if no one had ever moved in. Though I tried to return to normal, I still saw the figure in the window and heard faint chanting drifting through the walls. Now, I never go out at night. I avoid the house and I don't answer my door after dark. But sometimes, even in the safety of my locked room, I feel them watching me, waiting with their hollow, empty eyes.